The morning was clear at the small regional airport. The sound of plane engines and the murmur of passengers filled the air, creating the familiar blend of anxiety and anticipation found in any terminal. In the distance, a commercial jet rested on the runway, its fuselage reflecting the soft morning sun. Inside the cockpit, Captain Olivia, a woman of strong and confident presence, completed her final pre-flight checks. She was used to hard work, having dedicated years of her life to aviation. But today, there was something more in the air besides routine, an invisible tension, something on the verge of unraveling. In the boarding area, Mary, a middle-aged woman, waited impatiently. She fiddled with her phone, sighing loudly, and exchanging looks of disdain with the staff. Her eyes scanned the room with a sense of superiority, as if the mere fact that she had to wait was a personal offense. The clock read 8:45, and the flight she was waiting for still hadn't been announced. When the boarding crew announced the start of the boarding process, first class was called, and Mary rushed to the front of the line. The sound of quick footsteps and quiet conversations filled the air as the other passengers followed protocol. However, when Mary reached the door of the plane and caught sight of Captain Olivia in the cockpit, the discomfort she had been feeling turned into visible shock. "Wait a minute," she muttered, her voice louder than necessary. "Is this some kind of joke?" Her furrowed brow and narrowed eyes revealed the brewing storm. Mary stared directly at Captain Olivia, noticing her dark skin and determined features. Olivia, who had been adjusting her seat, noticed Mary's suspicious look. Although it was an uncomfortable situation, it wasn't a new one for her. Throughout her career, she had faced numerous challenges, not only because she was a woman in a male-dominated field, but also because of her skin color. She had learned how to handle it. But this time, something in Mary's stare gave her a feeling that things could escalate. "Excuse me, are you the pilot?" Mary's voice was filled with incredulity and contempt. She shot a look at the flight attendant next to her, expecting someone to tell her there had been a mistake. "I'm not sure I feel safe with this," she said, hesitating on how to phrase her words without completely revealing the venom behind them. The crew, accustomed to handling unpleasant remarks, stepped in politely. "Yes, ma'am. Captain Olivia is one of our most experienced pilots. There's no reason for concern." But the polite response did nothing to calm Mary. "It's not about experience," she said, her tone sharp. "It's about trust. Are you really expecting me to trust my life to—" She stopped, leaving the implication hanging in the air, but clear to everyone. Mary's words sliced through the surrounding silence. Some passengers, already seated, began exchanging uncomfortable glances, while others watched with growing interest. The previously casual, relaxed atmosphere shifted. Embarrassment spread like a shadow through the plane. Olivia remained calm, but inside, she felt the familiar sting of injustice. Those words, that undeserved doubt, rekindled old memories of racism and prejudice she had faced since the start of her career. With all her experience, Olivia knew she couldn't let the situation escalate. Maintaining her composure, she stood up and walked toward Mary, looking her directly in the eyes. "Ma'am, I can assure you that I am fully qualified to pilot this aircraft," Olivia said, her voice firm but without hostility. "If there are any safety concerns, my team and I are here to handle them." Olivia's calm, professional response should have ended the matter. But Mary didn't back down. In fact, her expression hardened even further. "That's not something you can guarantee," she said. "Maybe I should consider another flight." The insinuation was clear. Mary's problem wasn't about safety, but about who was in charge. By this point, the other passengers' glances became more pronounced. Some seemed outraged by Mary's behavior, while others simply observed with growing curiosity. But no one spoke up. The flight attendant, realizing the situation was on the verge of spiraling out of control, stepped in again. "Ma'am, if you have any doubts about your safety or the flight, we'd be happy to discuss them with you after boarding. Right now, all procedures are in line with the highest standards." But Mary, unfazed, shook her head, and crossed her arms in a defiant gesture. "This is ridiculous. I'm going to file an official complaint. I don't trust this." The silence hung thick in the air. Everyone seemed frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Mary's words echoed, each one heavier than the last. She didn't know it yet, but she had just planted the seeds of an event that would change the perspective of many on board. And so, the central conflict was set. It wasn't just about a flight, but a much bigger confrontation, rooted in deep prejudices and ignorance. Mary represented fear and distrust, while Olivia, with her experience and dignity, represented the constant fight against those invisible barriers. Now, everyone waited to see what would happen next. The stage was set, and the tension in the air was palpable. The gears of the story had begun to turn. Every look, every word, was building the tension. The audience, caught in the moment, knew something big was about to happen, but no one could predict the impact of the events to come. Before we dive deeper into this powerful story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you're passionate about content that sheds light on important issues and sparks meaningful discussions, this is the place for you. Hit the notification bell to stay updated and be part of a community that seeks change through reflection and dialogue. The plane was almost ready for takeoff. Inside the cockpit, Captain Olivia returned to her duties, though she could still feel Mary's piercing gaze on her. The veiled accusations, the contempt, were all too familiar. This wasn't the first time her abilities had been questioned simply because of who she was, and it wouldn't be the last. Olivia took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. Her responsibility was to fly the plane with precision, ensuring the safety of everyone on board, no matter the prejudices she faced. Outside the cockpit, Mary was still unsettled. She had considered leaving the flight altogether, but found herself unable to act. Perhaps it was the fear of seeming unreasonable in the eyes of the other passengers, or maybe it was her refusal to acknowledge how deeply ingrained her own biases were. Either way, Mary remained seated in first class, her expression sour and discontented. Her fingers drummed impatiently on the armrest as her gaze wandered around the cabin, clearly displeased. As the passengers settled into their seats, soft whispers began to spread. A woman sitting a few rows away murmured to her husband, "Did you hear what she said? That's outrageous." Her husband nodded in agreement, a serious expression on his face. "Yeah, ridiculous. But people like her exist." Elsewhere in the plane, a young couple was discussing the situation in hushed tones. "She's acting like a Karen," the woman said, referencing the stereotype of privileged, entitled behavior. "It's insane," the man added. "She doesn't even realize how absurd she's being." Other passengers remained silent, uncomfortable with what they had witnessed. Some avoided looking at Mary altogether, while others cast furtive glances in her direction, clearly disapproving but unwilling to intervene. The atmosphere in the plane had shifted, becoming heavier with an unspoken tension that everyone felt but no one wanted to confront. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Olivia and her co-pilot, Marcus, were making the final preparations for takeoff. Marcus, a promising young pilot, had noticed the slight discomfort in Olivia's demeanor. Though he hadn't heard the full exchange between Mary and Olivia, he had seen enough to understand that something was off. "Everything okay with that passenger?" Marcus asked quietly, careful not to disrupt Olivia's focus. Olivia paused for a moment before responding. "It's fine, Marcus. Just another day on the job," she said, downplaying the incident. But both of them knew that what had happened left a mark. Marcus wanted to say more, to offer support, but he respected Olivia's silence and turned his attention back to the task at hand. As the plane taxied down the runway, the hum of the engines drowned out any remaining conversations. The crew was busy with final safety checks, and the passengers fastened their seatbelts, settling into their own thoughts. Yet the tension between Mary and the rest of the cabin remained palpable. She could feel the weight of their judgment, but instead of reconsidering her actions, it only reinforced her sense of being in the right. In Mary's mind, she was the victim of an unjust situation, and everyone else was wrong for not seeing it. As the plane gained speed, the passengers were pushed back into their seats, the momentary silence of takeoff offering a brief respite from the emotional strain. The next few minutes were filled with the steady hum of the engines as the aircraft reached cruising altitude. It was then that Mary, unable to contain her frustration, pressed the call button for a flight attendant once more. Her hand trembled slightly as she made the motion, a mix of nerves and simmering anger, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. When the young attendant appeared, her expression was cautious but professional. "Yes, ma'am. How can I assist you?" the attendant asked, her voice measured. Mary looked directly at her, her voice low but firm. "I want to speak to the captain, or rather the captain," she corrected herself, emphasizing the title in a way that made it clear she still doubted Olivia's authority. Now, the request caught the attendant off guard. It was highly unusual for a passenger to request a direct conversation with the pilot mid-flight, especially without a clear emergency. "Ma'am," the attendant began, trying to remain calm, "I understand you may have concerns, but Captain Olivia is currently flying the plane and needs to focus on operating the aircraft. I can pass along any message you'd like, though." "No," Mary cut in sharply, her tone rising. "I want to speak to her directly. I want her to tell me that I'm safe on this flight. This isn't a request. It's a demand." Now more passengers were beginning to take notice, their eyes turning toward Mary's row. The flight attendant, visibly uncomfortable, was about to insist that this wasn't possible when another voice interrupted the tense exchange. "Excuse me," said Denise, the African-American woman from the back of the plane. She had stood up and was now walking toward Mary with calm but determined steps. "What exactly are you hoping to achieve here?" Mary turned toward Denise, her face a mixture of disbelief and barely contained anger. "I don't have to explain myself to you," Mary snapped coldly. "This is a matter of personal safety." Denise didn't flinch. Her voice was steady, but the challenge in her tone was unmistakable. "Safety? Or is this about you not wanting to admit that you're being prejudiced? Because so far, all you've done is question the ability of a woman based on nothing but the color of her skin." The tension in the cabin skyrocketed. All eyes were now on the two women, and the silence that followed was suffocating. The flight attendant, realizing that things were spiraling out of control, tried once again to intervene. "Ladies, please, I ask that we remain calm. We can resolve this as smoothly as possible." But before the situation could be diffused, Mary's emotions boiled over. "I am not prejudiced," she yelled, standing up from her seat. Her voice was sharp and filled with indignation. "I have the right to question who's flying this plane. If something happens, it's our lives at stake. And just because you—" She hesitated, as if realizing how far she was going, but was unable to stop herself. "Just because you don't see a problem doesn't mean I can't." Denise stayed standing, her eyes locked on Mary's. "The only problem you're seeing is the one you brought with you. It's not Olivia. It's not her skin color. It's your prejudice." Her voice was calm but firm, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You're refusing to see the truth, because admitting it would mean admitting that you're wrong." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the cabin, including Mary, knew exactly what Denise was implying. And for the first time, Mary didn't have a response. She blinked rapidly, trying to process the weight of Denise's words. Before Mary could respond, a new figure appeared at the cockpit door. It was Captain Olivia. She walked calmly down the aisle toward Mary and Denise, her uniform pristine, and her posture exuding a quiet authority. The entire cabin fell into a tense, expectant hush as Olivia approached. Though it wasn't her responsibility to deal with difficult passengers in this way, something inside her compelled her to act. "Ma'am," Olivia began, her voice low but commanding, "I'm aware of your concerns, but I need to make something very clear. I am the captain of this flight, and it is my job to ensure the safety of everyone on board, including you." Mary, who had been furious just moments before, now felt a wave of unease wash over her. There was something in Olivia's calm, steady gaze, a quiet dignity that Mary had ignored until now. She was used to throwing her weight around, but here, in front of Olivia, her confidence wavered. "I'm not doubting your experience," Mary began, her voice now hesitant. "But I just think—" Olivia cut her off, not with words, but with a steady, unyielding look. "If you're afraid of flying, I understand. Many people are. But what you're expressing here isn't fear of flying. It's something beyond that." The cabin fell into another suffocating silence. Every passenger, including Mary, understood what Olivia was alluding to, and for the first time, Mary couldn't find her words. She felt her face flush with embarrassment, her cheeks growing hot as Olivia's words sank in. Denise, who had remained standing, watched the scene with a mix of pride and relief. There was something powerful in seeing Olivia confront prejudice head-on, without anger, without desperation, but with a quiet, unshakable strength. "If you'd prefer to leave the plane, I understand," Olivia continued, her voice steady. "I can arrange for that as soon as we reach our next destination. But while we're in the air, you can rest assured that my team and I will do everything in our power to ensure this flight is safe and smooth for everyone." Olivia locked eyes with Mary, waiting for her response. The entire cabin held its breath, watching the two women who, in different ways, embodied opposite sides of a much larger conflict. Mary finally looked down, her eyes avoiding everyone's gaze. For the first time, she seemed on the verge of tears. She didn't know what to say. All her anger, all her conviction that she was in the right, was crumbling. Denise's words, and now Olivia's, had penetrated the wall she had built over the years, the wall of privilege and prejudice that, until now, had never been challenged so directly. Mary started to speak, but her voice failed her. She glanced around, feeling the weight of the passengers' gazes on her. For the first time, she felt vulnerable, exposed. And then, in a move that no one expected, she simply sat back down in her seat without saying another word. Olivia, sensing that the conflict was over, nodded slightly, showing no bitterness. She turned and walked back to the cockpit, where Marcus was waiting for her, his eyes full of admiration for the way she had handled the situation. In the cabin, the tension finally began to dissipate. Passengers exchanged murmurs, their voices growing quieter as the situation diffused. Denise, satisfied that the confrontation had reached a conclusion, returned to her seat, knowing she had done her part. The flight continued, uninterrupted, and the calm that settled over the plane felt like a breath of fresh air after a storm. Mary remained silent for the rest of the journey, her thoughts swirling. She had arrived at her destination safely, but she knew she would leave the plane a different person than when she had boarded. And as the plane flew smoothly through the skies, one small but significant battle against prejudice had been fought, and perhaps won. The flight continued smoothly, cruising through thick, white clouds, but inside the cabin, the tension that had briefly subsided was beginning to resurface. Mary was still restless in her seat, Denise's words echoing in her mind. Though she had outwardly remained silent after the confrontation, internally, she was waging a battle. She was torn between the uncomfortable sting of being called out for her prejudice and her steadfast belief that she had been justified in her actions. No one had ever questioned her like that, much less in front of others. Meanwhile, other passengers were quietly watching Mary. They sensed that the situation wasn't fully resolved. The air felt heavy, as if they were waiting for another outburst or development. Despite the calm exterior of the flight, the cabin was charged with an undercurrent of tension, ready to spark at any moment. Unable to shake the discomfort she felt, Mary pressed the call button for the flight attendant once again. This time, her hands trembled slightly, not just from anger, but from uncertainty. When the young attendant appeared, her face was composed but cautious, knowing that things were still fragile after the earlier incident. "Yes, ma'am. How can I assist you?" The attendant's tone was polite, but there was a clear edge of alertness. Mary locked eyes with her, speaking in a low but firm voice. "I need to speak to the captain. I want to hear from her directly." The flight attendant blinked in surprise, unsure of how to respond. It was highly unusual for a passenger to request direct access to the captain mid-flight without a serious reason. "Ma'am," she started carefully, "I understand your concern, but Captain Olivia is busy flying the plane. I can relay any message." "No," Mary interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "I want to speak to her. I need her to personally tell me that I'm safe on this flight." The other passengers were beginning to take notice of Mary's rising voice again. Several turned their heads toward her row, sensing the escalation. The flight attendant hesitated, trying to maintain control of the situation. "I'm afraid that's not possible during the flight, ma'am. Captain Olivia is responsible for the safety of everyone on board, and—" But before she could finish, Denise stood up from her seat in the back of the plane. She calmly walked toward Mary, her face composed but determined. The other passengers watched closely, anticipating another confrontation. "Excuse me," Denise began, her voice level but firm. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" Mary turned to face Denise, her expression a mix of indignation and disbelief. "This is about my safety," she snapped, her tone defensive. "I have every right to know if I can trust who's flying this plane." Denise held her gaze, not backing down. "No, it's not about safety. If it were, you wouldn't be acting like this. You don't trust her because of her skin color, and that's the real issue here." The air in the cabin seemed to freeze. Everyone was listening intently now, the tension thick enough to cut. The flight attendant, standing nearby, looked increasingly uncomfortable but didn't intervene, sensing that this was no longer something she could mediate. "I am not a racist." Mary's voice shook with anger, and she stood from her seat. "I have the right to question who's in control of my safety. It's my life at stake. And just because you refuse to see the issue doesn't mean it doesn't exist." Denise remained calm, her voice unwavering. "The only issue here is the one you've created in your own mind. This isn't about experience or safety. It's about your own prejudice, and you don't want to admit that." The tension in the cabin was palpable. All eyes were on the two women, and even those who had been trying to ignore the situation earlier couldn't look away now. The flight attendant, visibly stressed, tried once again to intervene. "Ladies, please, let's keep this calm. There's no need for this to escalate further." But before the situation could spiral any further, a new figure emerged from the cockpit. It was Captain Olivia. She walked down the aisle toward Mary and Denise with calm, measured steps, her face composed and her presence commanding. The passengers fell into a deep silence, watching intently as Olivia approached. This wasn't the sort of conflict she was obligated to address personally, but she felt compelled to step in. "Ma'am," Olivia said, her voice steady and authoritative, "I've been made aware of your concerns. I need to assure you, right now, that I am the captain of this flight, and it is my responsibility to ensure the safety of everyone on board, including you." Mary, who had been standing in anger moments before, suddenly seemed to deflate at Olivia's direct approach. There was something about the captain's calm, unyielding tone that made Mary hesitate. She was used to being in control, used to getting her way, but now she found herself facing someone who wasn't afraid of her demands. I don't doubt your experience," Mary stammered, her confidence wavering, "but I still feel like I have the right to ask." Olivia cut her off gently but firmly. "What you're asking for goes beyond your safety concerns. If you were genuinely afraid of flying, we could address that. But this is something else, and you need to understand that." Another wave of silence rolled through the cabin. The passengers, watching closely, understood what Olivia was alluding to, and many of them shared quiet, knowing looks. Mary, however, was still struggling to find a response. She blinked rapidly, her face flushing red with embarrassment as she realized that the situation had spiraled far beyond her control. "Denise," standing just a few feet away, observed the scene with a quiet satisfaction. Olivia's calm confrontation of the prejudice at play felt like a powerful statement. It wasn't filled with anger or resentment. Instead, it was a measured, dignified response to a situation that had spiraled out of ignorance. "If you prefer to leave the plane at our next destination, we can arrange that for you," Olivia continued, her voice steady and calm. "But while we're in the air, I can assure you that my crew and I are doing everything we can to keep you and everyone else on board safe." Olivia locked eyes with Mary, waiting for her response. The entire cabin held its breath, watching the scene unfold. In that moment, Mary realized that she had nowhere to turn. All of her anger, all of her conviction that she was in the right, had crumbled under the weight of Olivia's quiet strength and Denise's earlier confrontation. Mary started to speak, but her voice faltered. She glanced around the cabin, seeing the eyes of the other passengers on her. For the first time, she felt truly exposed, and a wave of shame washed over her. Unable to respond, she simply sat back down in her seat, silent. Olivia, sensing the conflict had come to an end, nodded slightly, showing no bitterness or anger. She turned and walked calmly back to the cockpit, where Marcus was waiting. He looked at her with a mix of admiration and respect. "That was incredible," Marcus said quietly as Olivia returned to her seat. Olivia smiled faintly, though there was a trace of weariness in her expression. "It's part of the job," she said, her voice soft. "We do what we have to do, even when it's not easy." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of her words. What Olivia had done went beyond the usual responsibilities of a captain. She had confronted something much deeper than turbulence or mechanical issues. She had faced down ignorance and prejudice, and in doing so, had maintained her dignity and the respect of everyone watching. Back in the cabin, the tension finally began to ease. The passengers returned to their own thoughts and activities, but the impact of what had just occurred lingered in the air. Denise returned to her seat, feeling a sense of relief and pride. She had spoken up when it mattered, and Olivia had taken control of the situation with grace and authority. As the plane continued its smooth journey, Mary sat quietly, lost in thought. She didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the flight. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to question herself, her actions, her beliefs, and the deep-seated prejudices that had influenced her behavior. The realization was painful, but it was also the first step toward change. By the time the plane began its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. What had started as a simple flight had turned into a moment of reckoning for everyone on board, a confrontation with prejudice, fear, and the strength it took to stand up to both. When the plane landed and the passengers began to disembark, Mary lingered in her seat, waiting until most of the others had left before standing. She felt an overwhelming sense of embarrassment and regret, but also a strange sense of clarity. She didn't know what she would say, if anything, but as she passed by Denise's row on her way out, she glanced at her, and their eyes met. Denise gave her a small, understanding nod. It wasn't an act of forgiveness or pity. It was a simple acknowledgement. Mary opened her mouth to speak, but the words never came. Instead, she nodded back, silently acknowledging the impact of everything that had happened. And as the passengers walked off the plane, the lesson they had all witnessed remained in the air. Prejudice, whether overt or subtle, could be faced and dismantled, one confrontation at a time. Denise gave her a small, understanding nod. It wasn't an act of forgiveness or pity. It was a simple acknowledgement. Mary opened her mouth to speak, but the words never came. Instead, she nodded back, silently acknowledging the impact of everything that had happened. And as the passengers walked off the plane, the lesson they had all witnessed remained in the air. Prejudice, whether overt or subtle, could be faced and dismantled, one confrontation at a time. The flight continued its descent, approaching the destination. Inside the cabin, the mood had shifted once again. While the outward tension had dissolved, A sense of quiet reflection lingered among the passengers. What had started as a simple flight had transformed into something much deeper, a lesson, an eye-opening experience that had forced everyone in their own way to confront uncomfortable truths. Mary sat quietly in her seat, staring out the window. The clouds beneath them looked peaceful, their soft shapes a stark contrast to the turbulence she felt inside. Denise's words, and especially Captain Olivia's calm confrontation, still echoed in her mind. Though she had initially dismissed their accusations of prejudice, something had shifted. For the first time in her life, Mary began to question herself, her actions, and the beliefs she had held without ever really examining them. What if they were right? The thought disturbed her, twisting in her stomach like a knot she couldn't untangle. She had always seen herself as fair, reasonable. How could she possibly be the kind of person Denise had accused her of being? And yet, as she replayed the events in her mind, she began to see the cracks in her own defenses. The way she had demanded to speak to Olivia, the way she had questioned her competence, based on nothing but her appearance. It was undeniable. Her behavior, her reaction, was rooted in something more than just concern for safety. For the first time, Mary was forced to admit to herself that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. In another part of the plane, Denise sat back in her seat, staring ahead thoughtfully. She had done something she wasn't accustomed to, speaking up against someone like Mary. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Too often, Denise had encountered situations where she chose to stay quiet, not wanting to stir up trouble, to make a scene. But this time, something inside her had snapped, and she couldn't let it go. She felt a sense of pride in how she had handled the situation, but also a deeper sadness. The confrontation hadn't been about just one woman on a plane. It was about years of enduring subtle, quiet discrimination, the kind that people like Mary might not even realize they were perpetuating. But to people like Olivia and Denise, it was a constant reality, an invisible weight they carried with them every day. Denise glanced out of the window and sighed. Part of her hoped that Mary would reflect on what had happened, that perhaps this moment of shame and discomfort would plant the seeds of change. But she knew that change, especially on such deep-seated issues, wasn't easy. It would take time, if it ever happened at all. Still, there was a small glimmer of hope, a possibility that Mary had learned something, even if she wasn't ready to admit it yet. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Olivia and Marcus were guiding the plane through its final approach. The earlier confrontation hadn't visibly rattled Olivia, but Marcus could sense that the situation had affected her. He admired the way she had handled it, with grace and calm, even under the pressure of such blatant prejudice. It wasn't just about professionalism. It was about Olivia's deep-rooted dignity and strength. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked quietly, after a few moments of silence. Olivia didn't take her eyes off the controls as she responded. "I'm fine, Marcus. I've dealt with worse." There was a long pause before Marcus spoke again. "I know you have," he said, his voice low, but filled with respect. "But that doesn't mean it's fair." Olivia finally turned to look at him, a tired but appreciative smile playing on her lips. "Life isn't always fair. We just have to keep doing our jobs, and doing them well. That's the best way to prove them wrong." Marcus nodded. He knew Olivia was right, but he still felt a lingering frustration on her behalf. She had to deal with so much more than any of their other colleagues, and yet, she handled it with grace that most people could only aspire to. It wasn't fair, but it was reality, and Olivia, more than anyone, knew how to navigate that reality. As the plane descended through the clouds, the lights in the cabin were dimmed in preparation for landing. The passengers, now mostly quiet, began to gather their belongings, preparing for the end of the journey. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, ensuring that everyone was seated and secured for the final approach. Mary remained in her seat, still lost in thought. The realization of her behavior, of what it truly represented, weighed heavily on her. She had come onto this flight full of confidence, certain that she was in the right, but now she felt unsure, unsettled. What would she say when she got off the plane? Would she try to justify her actions to herself, to others, or would she let this experience change her? The plane touched down smoothly on the runway, prompting a small round of applause from a few passengers. It was a common gesture of appreciation, but this time, it felt heavier with unspoken meaning. Captain Olivia had done her job impeccably, as always, guiding the plane and its passengers safely to their destination. And yet, for some on board, this flight had been more than just a journey. It had been a moment of reckoning. As the plane taxied to the gate, the passengers began to stir, gathering their bags and preparing to disembark. Denise remained in her seat, watching as people around her moved, wondering what they had taken away from the experience. Had they understood what had really happened, or would they brush it off as an uncomfortable moment, something to forget as soon as they left the plane? For Mary, however, it wouldn't be so easy to forget. She sat still, waiting until most of the passengers had left before she even unbuckled her seatbelt. When she finally stood, she glanced back at Denise, who was still seated. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them. Not forgiveness, but an acknowledgement that this encounter had been significant. As Mary walked toward the exit, her steps felt heavy, burdened by the weight of her newfound self-awareness. She had been wrong, and now she had to live with that knowledge. Whether or not she chose to change was a question she wasn't ready to answer, but the fact that she was even asking it was a start. Captain Olivia, now standing at the front of the plane with the other crew members, watched as the passengers exited. She made eye contact with each one, offering a polite nod or a smile. When Mary approached, Olivia's gaze softened, though she remained composed. "Thank you," Mary muttered quietly as she passed by Olivia. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but Olivia heard it. Without missing a beat, Olivia gave her a small, respectful nod. "Have a good day, ma'am." It wasn't an acknowledgement of forgiveness, but it was enough for Mary to understand that Olivia held no grudge. Olivia had long ago learned that her strength didn't come from resentment, but from rising above these moments with grace and professionalism. And today had been no different. As the last of the passengers left the plane, the crew began their usual post-flight routines, cleaning and preparing the aircraft for its next journey. Life moved on. Flights continued. People came and went. But the events of that particular flight, the confrontation, the lesson, the quiet strength of Olivia, would stay with those who had witnessed it. Denise was one of the last passengers to disembark. As she walked past Olivia, she gave her a knowing nod, a gesture of respect and solidarity. Olivia smiled, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The flight had ended, but the impact would last far longer. For Mary, for Denise, and for everyone else on that plane, the lesson was clear. Prejudice, whether it's subtle or overt, can be confronted. And when it is, it forces everyone, those directly involved and those who witness it, to reflect on their own beliefs and actions. As Captain Olivia prepared for her next flight, she knew that this was just one moment in a long career filled with similar challenges. But she also knew that every time she faced those challenges with dignity, she chipped away at the larger walls of ignorance and prejudice that still existed. And as the plane took off once again, the sky vast and open before it, Olivia flew forward, as she always had, with quiet, unshakable strength. If this story moved you, and you believe we should continue bringing important discussions like this one, subscribe to the channel now. Share your thoughts and follow us for more content that makes us think, question, and above all, grow. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. Together, we can create conversations that matter. And before you go, check out the recommended videos on the end screen. Keep watching and dive into more stories that inspire change.